out today. My name is Yoram Bauman. I appear before you this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, as the world's first and only stand-up economist. It's a niche market. I really only have one thing going for me as a stand-up economist, and that's low expectations. Actually, that's not true. I have one other thing going for me as a stand-up economist. I get to make fun of macroeconomists. You know, I'm a real economist because I can make fun of subdisciplines that are totally indistinguishable to people on the outside. You know, people in Washington State, where I live, make fun of people in Oregon, and people in Alabama make fun of people in Mississippi, and people in prison make fun of people in graduate school. You know, when they invited me to come and do this lecture series, they pretty much told me that the only thing they wanted to make sure, the only rule that I had was that I couldn't say anything that would offend anybody. So I figured I would start with some jokes about politics. Now, I like to tell jokes about politics that appeal to people across the political spectrum. This is, I think, a difficult thing to do in Texas. Because in Texas, I'm not sure there's much political spectrum. But with your permission, I'm actually going to create a political spectrum, so this is audience participation. So the way most people think about politics is left-wing, right-wing. So the thing we're going to do, I'm going to divide you up. You folks over here on the left side of the room for the next couple of minutes, audience participation. You folks over here on the left for the next couple of minutes, you guys get to represent the left wing of the American political spectrum. A little too much enthusiasm for the left wing of the American political spectrum, but otherwise I was all right. Now you folks are on the right, I need you guys to come through for me. You guys are my right wing. That was pretty good. But the last time I was in Houston doing this, they started chanting USA. I want you guys to do that for me. You guys are my right wing. USA! 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 That was okay. That was okay, right wing. You guys over here on the left, though, you guys were perfect. No, because all the right wing was chanting USA, you were just sitting there looking befuddled and vaguely unpatriotic. Now that's what most people think about politics as left wing, right wing, but if you think about economics or political science and what's called median voter theory, right, you know that actually leaves out something quite important. The left wing is actually, this room is perfect. The left wing is over here, right, and the right wing is over here. And you all in the middle, you all are the most important part of the American political spectrum. You all are my swing voters. Now, a couple of very important things about swing voters. First of all, there are lots of swing voters in America. Okay, if you are not a communist or a fascist, then you are probably a swing voter. And if you do not know the difference between a communist and a fascist, then you are definitely a swing voter. Now your job, swing voters, when it comes to politics and current events, your job is extremely important. Your job is to pay absolutely no attention whatsoever. And then every 4 years, you determine the fate of the free world. I know that sounds like a big responsibility, okay, but trust me, don't give it a second thought. And that's really how the political spectrum is divided. Okay, you got the left wing. The stereotype about the left wing is spineless. You got the right wing is heartless. You got the middle is clueless. Clueless and apathetic. You're so clueless you don't know what apathetic means. You're so apathetic you can't be bothered to look it up. There are also, of course, the extremes of the American political spectrum, the far right of the American political spectrum, just folks over here on the far right. You all on the far right get to be my libertarians. That's cool, sir. You can do what you want. Far left of the American political spectrum, folks over here on the far left, you all on the far left get to be my libertarians. I'm seeing confused looks from the swing voters. No, I had someone in the middle once who was like, libertarians? You mean the people that check books out for me? And I had to clarify that libertarians are freedom lovers. right? They come in two flavors. You got right-wing libertarians. They want everybody to be free to use guns. You can move, sir, if you'd like. You've got left-wing libertarians. They want everybody to be free to use drugs. You can move, sir, if you'd like. Now, both wings of the Libertarian Party want to abolish Social Security and Medicare, right? Which makes total sense, okay? Because who's going to make it to 65 when the world is full of pistol-packing potheads and meth fiends with machine guns? I just did a show in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I didn't even manage to make it through that routine because I was like, libertarians on this side, you guys like guns. And this guy spoke up, he was about 60. He spoke up, he was like, don't take away my guns, boy! I'm not taking away your guns, sir, I was just trying to make a joke. Please don't hurt me. Anyway, I've been thinking a lot about politics lately because I went to China last year for 5 months. And it had been my first time in China, and I didn't really know what to expect. And I wanted to have something to say in case the Chinese people came up to me and were like, tell me about democracy. Yeah, that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was I went to China, and the Chinese people were like, what's up with your budget deficit? And I had to say, let me tell you about democracy. I know, like, the left blames the right, and the right blames the left, but I actually blame the center. I don't think we have a budget deficit because left-wing people believe in mandates, or because right-wing people believe in markets. We have a budget deficit because the middle believes in magic. No, I'm serious. Every time a left-wing politician says, hey, I've got a great idea for a road, or a school, or a hospital, swing voters are like, yeah, let's do that. Then every time a right-wing politician says we should cut taxes, swing voters are like, yeah, let's do that. And then it turns out we have a budget deficit and you blame the politicians, which is kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, this is like, going to the doctor for your checkup and the doctor tells you you've been putting on weight and the left side of your brain is like, I guess I better exercise more. And the right side of your brain says, I guess I better stop eating so many donuts. And the middle part of your brain says, I guess I better get a new doctor. It doesn't work that way. Before I go any further, I should show you my t-shirts. I enjoy capitalism t-shirts. Made in China. If you look at the tag, it's actually 80% cotton and 20% irony. I actually I lived in China last year for 5 months. I want to show you the place where I lived in China, and I apologize that some folks over here aren't going to be able to see the slides, but that's life. That's right. So this is the place where I lived in Beijing. This was the view from my apartment window. You can see this nice housing complex down the street. I lived in a place in Beijing that housed 400,000 people, in a housing complex for 400,000 people, and I was one of 2 non-Chinese people there. It was me and a guy that everybody there referred to as the black guy, which I thought was extra hilarious when I realized that they were all calling me the white guy. But one day I actually met the black guy. He was from Ghana. He was there on a scholarship. Super nice guy. We went to McDonald's and had lunch. Anyway, this is the view from my window about 5% of the time. Much more often, the view from my window looked like that. Yeah, so still some pretty serious pollution problems going on in China. After I was in China, I went to Singapore for a couple of days. And there were some things that were good about being in China for 5 months and then going to Singapore instead of going directly from the United States. For example, in Singapore, relative to the United States, they drive on the other side of the road. But this turned out to be no problem for me because I'd just been in China for 5 months where they drive on all sides of the road and on the sidewalk as well. Some things, however, were difficult about being in China and then going to Singapore. When I was in Singapore, I felt like I missed some of the free speech opportunities. that had been available to me when I was in China. Now, this may surprise you, but there actually is a decent amount of free speech in China, especially for Westerners speaking English. I did a show in Beijing and opened up my show by saying that I wanted to welcome everybody to the latest meeting of Occupy Beijing. And I said I was pleased to see such a large turnout, especially in light of what happened after our previous meeting 23 years ago. Some jokes are not supposed to be funny. And nobody messed with me, nobody bothered me, the Chinese government didn't harass me in any way, and there's a simple explanation for why. If you think about the bureaucrats who work for the Chinese government, they place a much higher priority on corruption rather than censorship. And you only have so much time. Right? So why should you bother going after some guy telling jokes about Tiananmen Square when you can spend your time kicking peasants off their land so that you can resell the land to condo developers? Right now, Singapore is actually very different. In Singapore, they have all these anti-corruption campaigns, and like the government is very efficient. It's like free market authoritarianism in Singapore. And Singapore is the only place where I've gone to do comedy, where I check into the hotel and people are like, "Oh, what are you here to do in Singapore?" And I say, "Oh, I'm here to do some comedy shows." And they all said, "Uh-oh." Like, be careful. And then they started giving me a list of things that I shouldn't tell jokes about. So I want to share with you my list of things that are off limits to tell jokes about in Singapore. Politics, race, and religion are all off limits. I was told not to tell jokes about the government. I was told not to tell jokes about people named Lee. Which is actually kind of the same thing as the government. And finally, this is a direct quote from somebody. He said, "Don't say anything that might offend anybody." Which I guess is good advice. People often wonder how I got started doing stand-up comedy about economics, as if it is not the most natural thing in the whole world. And I got started with this next little, oh no, wait, I have one more China joke I have to share with you. Sorry. I'm going to do another bit, but first I have to tell you the China joke. Everybody in China knows that China owns like $3 trillion in U.S. government debt. Now, they don't necessarily understand what it means. I had one fellow there who insisted to me, my Mandarin is very bad, but he insisted to me, this was like a taxi driver, who said America is a Gao Li Dai, which means loan shark. Right? And I was like, America is not a loan shark. I mean, that's exactly backwards. America is like a borrowing whale. We're just like floating in a sea of our own treasury debt. And this guy in China was like, don't talk to me about that treasury debt. You know it's lousy. And here in China, we're pissed off that you sold us that treasury debt. And I said, that's really interesting, because in America, we're pissed off that you bought it. Now, I want to point out that this is actually the opposite of the way that economics is supposed to work. Right? You're supposed to, in economics, get mutual benefits from voluntary trade, but to end up with a situation where you have voluntary transactions between two parties, and both of them are unhappy about it, that actually takes a considerable amount of effort. In any case, I told the guy in China I was sorry, I apologized on behalf of my entire country. And I said that if I could go back in time, I would have encouraged the Chinese government to invest that money somewhere else, like Greece. All right, so this is the routine that got me started doing economics comedy. So this is Mankey's Principles of Economics Translated. So Greg Mankey was a Harvard professor. He wrote one of the best-selling economics textbooks in the country, and it's based on these 10 principles of economics. I know there's a lot on the screen. And I know some of you can't see the screen, but it's okay, because I encourage people not to try to read these. Just take my word that you pretty much need a PhD in economics to understand these 10 principles. Fortunately, I have a PhD in economics, so I've taken it upon myself to translate these principles for the more fortunate among you. We're going to begin by separating into the first 7 principles, which are microeconomics, and the last 3, which are macroeconomics. The difference, of course, as P.J. O'Rourke said, being that microeconomists are wrong about little things, and macroeconomists are wrong about big things. We're going to start with the macro principles 8, 9, and 10. Now, believe it or not, these all have the exact same translation, namely, blah, blah, blah. As proof, I need only remind you that macroeconomists have successfully predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions. And as further proof, we can now go up 1 font size. So let's go back to the micro principles now. The first one, people face trade-offs. This is a very simple idea at the heart of economics, and the translation is also very simple. Choices are bad. Okay. Now this is a simple syllogism. Trade-offs are bad. Anytime you have choices, you have trade-offs. Therefore, choices have to be bad. If you don't understand that, take a look at the second principle. The cost of something is what you give up to get it. Translation, choices are really bad. Now, I have a simple little demonstration of this fact. Let's say that someone offers you a Snickers bar, okay, that you value at $1. Right, then what you can loosely think of as your economic profit in this situation is the dollar of the Snickers bar minus the cost of what you give up to get it, which is nothing. Your economic profit is, don't all answer at once, is $1. Okay. Now, to begin to understand why choices are bad, imagine someone offers you a choice between the Snickers bar that you value at $1 and some M&Ms that you value at 70 cents. Okay, now your economic profit is the $1 minus the 70 cents, only 30 cents. You begin to understand why choices are bad. The worst possible situation, in fact, is being offered a choice between a Snickers bar and an identical Snickers bar. Because then your economic profit is 0. Right, now, people who are not trained in economics might say that that's no different than being offered one Snickers bar, but that kind of sloppy thinking will never get you an economics degree. Summarizing then, choices are bad, choices are really bad. I'm not going to beat around the bush with you folks. If you don't understand why choices are bad, you're probably stupid. Moving on, principle number 3, rational people think at the margin. Translation, people are stupid. Now it is immediately obvious that people do not think at the margin. Nobody goes to the grocery store and says, I'm going to buy an orange, I'm going to buy another orange, I'm going to buy another orange. That joke only makes sense to econ majors. People don't think like that. Okay, but if people don't think at the margin, and if as Mankiw says rational people do think at the margin, we are led to a most unhappy conclusion. People are not rational. People, in other words, are stupid. But before you spare for humanity, take a look at the next principle. People respond to incentives. Now, the dictionary says that incentive is a noun, and it's a synonym for motive. So when Mankiw says that people respond to incentives, what he's saying is that people are motivated by motives. You might think this is a bit like saying that tautologies are tautological, right? I mean, people would have to be pretty stupid to be unmotivated by motives. But remember principle 3. People are stupid. Hence the need for principle 4 to tell us that people aren't that stupid. All right, simplifying again, move on to every economist's favorite topic, free trade. Principle 5, trade can make everyone better off. Translation, trade can make everyone worse off. Now you may wonder how the translation of principle 5 is the opposite of the principle itself. I have a simple proof of this fact that will blow your mind. I want you to compare two statements. One of them is trade can make everyone better off, and the other one is trade will make everyone better off. Now if you had to pick one of those two statements to put in your best-selling economics textbook, right, which statement is stronger? Statement number 1 or statement number 2? Statement number 2 is better, right? But Mankiw doesn't use statement number 2. He uses statement number 1 instead. And if you think about why, there's only one possible explanation. Statement number 2 has got to be wrong. In other words, trade can make some people worse off, and from there it's just a hop, skip, and a jump that trade can make everyone worse off. Now, I figured some of you would have some questions about this, so I added a footnote with some details and eat your heart out. Now that we've cleared that up, I want you to see the last two principles. Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Translation, governments are stupid. And governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. Governments aren't that stupid. Follow immediately from principle 5 in its translation. Okay, if trade can make everyone better off, what do we need government for? Just let people trade. Governments are stupid. But if trade can make everyone worse off, we better have a government around to stop people from trading. So there are the 10 principles of economics translated. Much better, I hope you'll agree. Now, I performed this a couple of years ago and put it up on my website, standupeconomist.com, and on YouTube, not thinking all that much of it. And I'm a little embarrassed to say that it just passed 1 million hits on YouTube, which is a lot for economics jokes. Not a lot for videos about, like, puppies or Korean pop stars. But it's a lot for economics comedy videos, and many of these hits are because the video was posted on Greg Mankiw's blog. It turns out that he's a fan of my parody. Either that or else he comes from the school of there's no such thing as bad publicity. And in fact, I got to perform in his class at Harvard. It was the last leg of my 2008 Supply Side World Tour, which was mostly a trip to Israel with my father. But as long as I was there, I did some comedy there, and then I stopped off at Harvard on my way home. Originally, he wasn't going to tell the students I was coming. He just said there was a surprise guest who was coming to class. But then he had to tell them that I was coming because some students came to his office hours and said there was a rumor going around the Harvard campus that Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke was coming to class. I'd like to think they got the better end of the deal. In any case, one of the great things about YouTube is that not only do a lot of people waste a lot of time looking at videos on YouTube, a significant fraction of those people waste even more time commenting on videos on YouTube. To the point now where the comments are actually funnier than the video itself. So I'm going to share with you some of my favorites. Starting with someone with the screen name of Coolway. And Coolway writes, I can't tell whether this is supposed to be funny or educational. Choices are bad. Runner-up comments, you're funny, and I don't say that to a lot of people. Lots of people are not funny. Lots of people are sad. I like to think that I'm doing something new in the world by doing economics comedy. Apparently not. The next person writes, a Jew who's an economist and a stand-up comedian? You can't get any more stereotypical than that. The man in the video is the most stupid man in the world. Especially impressive given the competition. Not everybody's a fan of the video. The next person writes that's based off listening to this, just like in my real economics class. And then there are kind of the crazy people, like this next person who writes, they make economics boring and confusing on purpose because they don't want you to figure out that the whole economy is a Ponzi scheme. Now this person gets bonus points for creating a new word. Unpurpose. You may have a purpose, but do you have an unpurpose? And this is not the craziest thing that somebody wrote. The craziest thing somebody wrote was this. What a confusion of deceptions. The U.S. Congress does not print money as the Constitution dictates. That power was usurped by a cabal of international banksters in 1913. It's banksters. I spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out whether that was a typo. I was not an English major. And then my wife informed me that banksters equals bankers plus banksters. Yes, this is the financial mafia. You got the Italian mafia. The Italian mafia makes you offers that you can't refuse. And you've got the financial mafia. The financial mafia makes you offers that you can't understand. I finally understood that this person was talking about the Federal Reserve, the central bank here in the United States, which was created in 1913, but only because the next thing that they write is that the Federal Reserve is about as Federal Express. I honestly have no idea what that means. But I'm pretty sure this guy voted for Ron Paul. So after this guy writes this nasty stuff about the Federal Reserve on my YouTube comments page, somebody else feels compelled to come to the defense of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States on my YouTube comments page. So here's what the next person writes. In defense of the Fed, if we got rid of it, we'd still need to replace it with something that does its functions, i.e. printing money and clearing checks. Okay, the first of which the Fed doesn't do. The Treasury prints money, not the Fed. The second, clearing checks, is a very minor role that the Fed has. So somebody else has to write in and correct this person and say, actually, the Fed doesn't print money, and this is like an A+ answer. The Fed controls the money supply by expanding and contracting bank reserves. And then the first person writes back in and says, oh yeah, that's right, banks. So now we're getting like education on the YouTube comments page, which is always nice to see. Not all exchanges are this nice. One person writes in and says, translate? So somebody takes the bait and says, "You're poking fun at microeconomics." And the first person writes back and says, "Yeah, but translate, you jerk." Second person writes back and says, "That was a translation. You should probably stick to entertaining yourself with less intellectually demanding material." Not the meanest exchange on YouTube. The meanest exchange on YouTube starts with somebody who writes, "This video rules. By the way, I'm not an economist. I switched my major." Which prompts somebody else to write in and say, "Thanks for keeping us updated. Let us know when you drop out altogether and devote your life to smoking crack." Kids these days. I want to go back to this slide here, and I'm going to actually be serious for a couple minutes, and I will go back to telling you jokes, so bear with me for a few minutes, because this example in this footnote is actually a real example. It actually is possible in a very made-up economics model sort of way to have a situation where trade makes everyone worse off. Most of the time in economics we talk about trade making everyone better off, but there are possibilities where trade can make everyone worse off, and since it relates to the work that I do when I do serious academic work, this relates to that particular issue. So I want to talk you through this example real quick. So made-up economics story that I'm going to tell you about these three people, orange, pink, and blue, we're going to call them. And orange, pink, and blue live in a small town, and the small town has an air pollution problem. So think Beijing, but with three people. And maybe these people are all Americans because they each have a garage that's full of stuff that they don't use. All right? So now we're going to see some trade. So first, orange is going to sell a lawnmower to pink, and we can imagine orange sells his lawnmower to pink for $100, and maybe they each get $100 in value from that trade. Orange sells a lawnmower for $100 that was just sitting in her garage. Pink maybe would be willing to pay $200. She only has to pay $100, so she gets $100 in net benefits. Right, but when Pink starts using that lawnmower, lawnmowers create a little bit of air pollution. Maybe we can see a little bit of haze around the town. Right, like I said, made-up economic story. Maybe we can monetize the health impacts from asthma and stuff like that at $80 per person. Right, not just for orange and pink, but also for blue. So the impact on blue is what economists call a negative externality. Right, but note that orange and pink each get $20 in net benefits, so that trade still makes sense to them. There are a couple of empty seats here now, if anybody wants to come in and sit down. So now I'll tell you a similar story. Pink is going to sell a chainsaw to blue. I don't know why. But they each get $100 in benefits from that trade. Pink sells a chainsaw for $100. Blue will be willing to pay $200. She only has to pay $100. But when blue starts using the chainsaws also create a little bit of air pollution. Right? Maybe an additional $80 in healthcare costs for everyone. And now you just complete the circle. Blue is going to sell a wood chipper to orange. It's getting really bad. They each get $100 in benefits. Air pollution gets worse. Another $80 in healthcare costs for everyone. And now if you just add up any one of these columns, right, you see that after all three of those trades together, everybody ends up at minus 40. I get all sorts of answers to that question. 0, minus 100. Math is hard. Minus 40. So this is the tragedy of the commons or the prisoner's dilemma if you've come across these ideas, right? But the economics is that each person's trades are individually rational. If you ask any of the people who made these trades if they want to take back any of the trades that they made, they'll say no, because each trade they make leaves them $20 better off, but altogether the trades end up hurting everybody. Right, the particular issue that I work on, I'm an environmental economist. I spent a bunch of time working on climate change issues and global warming. So if you want to belabor the point and make a connection to climate change, you could like label the people, China, Europe, and North America. And this has been very broad strokes what economists are concerned about when it comes to climate change. Everything you need to know about climate change in just a couple of slides, and then I will go back to telling you jokes. First, carbon concentrations in the atmosphere going up. Nobody doubts this. Nobody doubts that it's caused by human activity, primarily fossil fuels and deforestation. Then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. This theory actually predates Al Gore. It goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden. And in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896 of about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome, because he lived in Sweden. And these days, we tend to be a little more concerned about what the impacts might be of kind of changing the basic functionings of planet Earth. In any case, we've been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so, and here are the results of the experiment. The blue dots are individual years, the red bars are 10-year average temperatures going up through the 1970s, and there's the 1980s, and there's the 1990s, and there's the 2000s. And for what it's worth, there's the first couple of years of this decade. Temperature's going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. If you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, it's okay. I'm going to try to find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation and innovation and the development of new technologies and all the things that I at least love about capitalism. So what I work on as an environmental economist is I work on using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. A couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system, but the point of both of those policies is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. This is generally the part where people stop laughing, because it's hard to argue that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and stuff like this, but there is a side benefit to these policies other than like potentially saving the world. And the side benefit is that if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue. And the government can do all sorts of things with that revenue. I'm sure you have your own ideas about what the government can do with a pile of revenue, but the idea that I work on is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So it's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting. And this is an idea that actually has support kind of across the economic spectrum, certainly from economists on the far left, pretty far left, like Paul Krugman, the folks on the right, like Greg Mankiw. Recently, there was, actually, this was a couple of years ago, but there was a bill introduced by 3 Republican congressmen in Washington, D.C. to partly replace the payroll tax, the employment tax in this country, with a carbon tax. And there's even a place that's actually implemented a policy like this. So I live in Seattle, and just to my north in the province of British Columbia, they've actually implemented what I and others consider to be the best climate policy in the world. They have a carbon tax, raises $3.5 billion over a couple of years, and all of that money is used to reduce personal and corporate income taxes in the province of British Columbia. So they now have the lowest personal income tax rates in Canada. They have the lowest business tax rates in the G7 group of rich countries, and there's an offset for low-income households. So really a terrific policy. And so I go around talking to folks about it, and if any of you are interested in class projects, I encourage you to take a look at something like this for Texas, for example. So in Texas, if you had a policy like this, so the tax is about $30 per ton of CO2. So that's the equivalent of 30 cents a gallon of gasoline. So it's not nothing. 3 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power. You could almost replace the sales tax in Texas. So get rid of the sales tax and have a carbon tax instead is kind of the serious pitch that I'm making to you. The last thing I want to say is I want to share with you what I call the 5 Chinas theory of the world. And the 5 Chinas theory of the world says that you can divide up the world population into 5 groups that are about the same size as China. Right, so China has 1.3 billion people. India has almost as many people as China. Everyone else in Asia, so Bangladesh, Indonesia, Pakistan, about the same size as China. The OECD is the rich world, mostly, so North America, Europe, Japan, principally, and then everyone else is mostly Latin America and Africa. Each of those 5 groups about the same size as China. If you look at fossil fuel emissions from those 5 groups, you get this picture, right, where the rich world basically uses half of the fossil fuels in the world, and what we've seen over the last couple of decades is this tremendous growth from China, and what we're hopefully going to see over the coming decades is more development in India and in Africa and the poor parts of the world, right, which is terrific. That development is terrific. But what I work on as an environmental economist is looking at some of the potential environmental downsides of all of that growth. So that's an issue that I think is going to be something that we're going to have to deal with over the next couple of decades. And now I will go back to telling you jokes, so thank you for bearing with me on that. Although I did this once for a very conservative crowd in Minnesota, and this guy came up to me at the end of my talk and said that the stuff I said about climate change was the funniest part of my whole routine. It has been a big year for economics comedy, ladies and gentlemen. I got to be on the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. Thank you. Now, I don't know how much, thank you. I don't know how much you all know about the world of stand-up comedy, but let me just tell you this. In the world of stand-up comedy, ladies and gentlemen, it does not get any bigger than the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. It was actually kind of amazing. They interviewed 3 economists on the show. They interviewed Ken Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize. They interviewed Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize. And they interviewed me. I felt like kind of a self-aware version of Sarah Palin. And what did they ask me? My moment of TV fame on the PBS NewsHour, they asked me if I'd ever bombed on stage. Okay, now, a couple of things about this. First of all, I am not afraid of failure. Okay, I'm an economist. Secondly, I'm a professional comedian, right? So if a joke doesn't work, you sort of keep throwing stuff out there until you find something that sticks. Which is basically the same thing that the Treasury Department and the Fed have been doing for the last couple of years. Finally, I had to admit on the PBS NewsHour that in fact I had bombed on stage. The worst show I ever did was in October of 2008, right at the start of the financial crisis. The stock market was tanking. October 2008, I did a show for some bankers. Yeah, they were not happy campers. And comedy is kind of a violent business, right? If you're doing well, you're killing. If you're doing badly, you're bombing. And I totally bombed that show. And I did so poorly, in fact, that I spent a fair amount of time afterwards sort of soul-searching, like trying to figure out where had I lost the connection with this audience of bankers in October of 2008. And I finally realized I lost them on my opening line. And my opening line was, "Hey, how's it going?" Apparently it wasn't going very well. I have since that time done a number of other shows for banks and other financial institutions, and I've discovered something very important from those shows. It's important to get paid in advance. Well, because you never know whether the bank is going to be there tomorrow. I did a show a couple of months ago for a bank. I'm not going to tell you, I'm not allowed to tell you what bank it is, but you know, well, it wouldn't be so far to go to find out which bank it was. And I was talking to the guy ahead of time, and I was like, "Look, you got to pay me in advance." And the fellow said to me, he said, "Do you take credit cards?" I was like, "The bank is offering to pay me with a credit card?" And I was like, "No, I don't take credit cards, but you can send me a check." And he said, "I'll have to look into whether we have that capability." It's a dangerous world we live in. Some other recent stories in economics comedy. This sign, Obama equals Keynesian, question mark. So Keynesian economics, of course, going back to John Maynard Keynes, is the idea that you can use fiscal or monetary policy to sort of get the economy out of a recession, for example. So the Obama stimulus, and previously that the Bush stimulus, those are all attempts at Keynesian policy. The stuff that the Federal Reserve does with interest rates is also, in a broad sense, Keynesian. So anyway, last year, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert had a rally to restore sanity in Washington, D.C., which apparently succeeded. And somebody showed up at that rally with this sign that said Obama equals Keynesian, question mark, and then took videotapes of all these lefties coming up to them and being really mad and saying like, "That is ridiculous! His birth certificate is on file in Hawaii!" He's not Kenyan. Another recent piece of economics humor, this paper, "Can Financial Innovation Help to Explain the Reduced Volatility of Economic Activity?" A real paper. One of the co-authors here, Doug Elmendorf, is the head of the Congressional Budget Office in Washington, D.C. The most interesting thing about this paper, of course, is that it was published in 2006, shortly before financial innovation led to the greatest increase in the volatility of economic activity since the Great Depression. You may think that this bodes ill for the research that was done by these scholars, but in fact it's okay. I have tracked down the abstract of this paper, the summary of the paper, and here's the abstract of the paper. No. No. I should proselytize briefly. I have a couple of these cartoon economics books. I guess they're for sale outside. You can see extras on my website, Stand Up Economist, if you want. They're super fun books, I'm happy to say. They have a whole bunch of these Nobel Prize jokes in them that try to explain what people won the Nobel Prize for. So here's Gary Becker saying sometimes crime does pay. And the King of Sweden is like, "Congratulations, you win the Nobel Prize." So Gary Becker is at the University of Chicago, and he won for applying economic ideas, the things we don't think about as being economics, like crime and drug addiction and family dynamics. John Nash has figured out the optimal strategy for rock, paper, scissors. So he won for foundational work in game theory. If you've seen the movie or read the book A Beautiful Mind, that's about John Nash. And if you haven't, I encourage you to at least see the movie because it is the last time that a male economist will be played by anybody as hot as Russell Crowe. Joseph Stiglitz, sometimes the invisible hand is invisible because it's not there, which is actually a classic Stiglitz line. Daniel Kahneman says human beings are not always rational. He's a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics a couple of years ago for work on behavioral economics. Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for looking at tragedy of common situations, especially fisheries around the world, and studying what actually happens in them. And then someday, somebody, probably Marty Weitzman at Harvard, will win for the idea that the way to get people to pollute less is to make polluting expensive. He did a lot of pioneering work in the 70s and still does great work. So anyway, those are the books. I'm happy to say some economists have said nice things about them. Greg Mankiw called it a painless way to learn economics, which I thought was especially generous coming from Greg Mankiw, given what I said about his book. I really think the only thing that I could have done that would have been meaner to Greg Mankiw would have been to write something on my blog calling his book A Painful Way to Learn Economics, which I didn't do, but still. There's my website, standupeconomist.com. I encourage you to go on my website, or if you got a business card, you give me your business card. I'll put you on my email list. I won't spam you, but I'll let you know when I have new videos or shows coming up. And in particular, I want to let you know that every year I run the humor session at the American Economic Association meeting, which is going to be in San Diego in January, and you are all invited. And if you're interested in economics, the whole Economic Association meeting is pretty great. It's like 10,000 economists from all over the world who converge on one city for a long weekend, and it's like wild. Thank you all for bringing me here today.